The story of the United States and Venezuela is one of power, oil, and decades of complex geopolitical maneuvering that reached its most dramatic climax just weeks ago. When we think about American involvement in Latin America, Venezuela stands out as a case study in how economic interests, ideological conflicts, and strategic concerns can shape international relations for over a century. Let me take you back to where this all began. The relationship between these two nations wasn't always antagonistic. In fact, during the late 1800s, the United States actually supported Venezuela in a boundary dispute with Britain. The Cleveland administration invoked the Monroe Doctrine, essentially telling European powers to stay out of the Americas. This was one of the first major assertions of American influence in the region, and it worked in Venezuela's favor. But as the 20th century dawned, everything changed when oil was discovered beneath Venezuelan soil. Suddenly, this South American nation became incredibly valuable to American interests. The United States began supporting whoever would give American companies the best deals, regardless of how they treated their own people. This meant backing brutal dictators like Juan Vicente Gomez, who ruled from 1908 to 1935, and later Marcos Perez Jimenez in the 1950s. These weren't just authoritarian leaders, they were genuinely horrific rulers who tortured and murdered thousands of their own citizens while American oil companies extracted billions of dollars worth of petroleum. The pattern was clear. As long as Venezuelan leaders kept the oil flowing to American companies, Washington didn't care much about human rights or democracy. This approach continued for decades, with the US training Venezuelan military and security forces at institutions like the School of Americas, where they learned techniques that were later used to suppress their own people. Everything shifted dramatically when Hugo Chavez came to power in 1998. Chavez represented something the United States hadn't seen in Venezuela for generations, a leader who put Venezuelan interests before American corporate profits. He nationalized the oil industry, used petroleum revenues for social programs, and openly criticized American foreign policy. This didn't sit well with Washington, which had grown accustomed to having compliant leaders in Caracas. The Bush administration's response was telling. In 2002, they gave tacit support to a military coup against Chavez. Declassified CIA documents later revealed that American officials knew about the coup plot weeks in advance but didn't warn the Venezuelan government. The coup briefly succeeded, removing Chavez from power for 47 hours before massive popular protests and loyal military units restored him to office. This failed coup attempt marked a turning point in US-Venezuelan relations, creating a deep mistrust that would define the relationship for the next 2 decades. When Chavez died in 2013, his successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited both the Bolivarian Revolution and the increasingly hostile relationship with the United States. Maduro, however, lacked Chavez's charisma and political skills. As oil prices collapsed and economic mismanagement took its toll, Venezuela plunged into a humanitarian crisis. Millions of people fled the country. Basic medicines became unavailable, and the economy contracted by more than 75%. The Trump administration, which took office in 2017, saw this crisis as an opportunity. They imposed harsh economic sanctions, recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president in 2019, and repeatedly threatened military intervention. Trump himself famously said that military action was certainly something that we could pursue when dealing with Venezuela. But it was during Trump's second term that the situation escalated beyond anything we had seen before. In August 2025, the United States began what it called Operation Southern Spear, deploying naval forces to the Caribbean in the largest military buildup in the region in decades. The stated goal was to combat drug trafficking, but everyone understood the real target was Maduro's government. Starting in September 2025, American forces began conducting deadly strikes on boats they claimed were carrying drugs from Venezuela. These weren't arrests or seizures, these were kill operations. By the end of December, the United States had conducted 30 known strikes, killing at least 107 people. Human rights groups and international law experts condemned these actions as extrajudicial killings, but the Trump administration pressed forward. The strikes weren't just happening at sea.
In late December 2025, American forces began hitting targets on Venezuelan soil, including what they claimed was a port used by the Tren de Aragua gang for smuggling operations. The Venezuelan government mobilized over 4 million militia members and volunteers, preparing for what seemed like an inevitable American invasion. Then came January 3rd, 2026, a date that will be remembered as one of the most dramatic in modern Latin American history. At 2 in the morning local time, explosions lit up the sky over Caracas as Operation Absolute Resolve began. This wasn't a full-scale invasion, but rather a precisely targeted operation designed to capture Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores. The operation was extraordinary in its scope and execution. 150 American aircraft from the Navy, Air Force and Marine Corps participated in the mission. They bombed Venezuela's air defenses across the northern part of the country, while Delta Force operatives, supported by CIA intelligence, raided Maduro's compound in Caracas. The United States even used one-way attack drones for the first time in operational combat. By 5:21 in the morning, it was over. President Trump announced on social media that Maduro and his wife had been captured and were being flown to New York to face federal criminal charges. The image Trump posted showed Maduro aboard the USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded and wearing a grey Nike sweatsuit, holding a plastic water bottle. It was a stunning visual representation of how completely the balance of power had shifted. What makes this operation particularly significant is that it represents the first time in modern history that the United States has successfully captured a sitting head of state from another sovereign nation. Previous American interventions in Latin America had typically involved supporting local coups or invasions, but Operation Absolute Resolve was a direct unilateral action that bypassed any pretense of working with Venezuelan institutions.
The legal and political implications are staggering. The Trump administration argued that the president has constitutional authority to use military force without congressional authorization as long as it supports American interests and doesn't result in prolonged military engagement. They also claimed that international law doesn't constrain this authority, a position that has alarmed legal experts and allies around the world. The operation appears to have been months in the planning. According to reports, American officials had been in contact with key Venezuelan leaders, including Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello, to ensure that security forces wouldn't resist the operation. This suggests that significant portions of Maduro's own government had essentially agreed to his removal, possibly in exchange for remaining in power themselves. The aftermath has been equally dramatic. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez appears to be leading a transitional government that the United States is willing to work with, at least temporarily. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has indicated that America won't directly govern Venezuela, but will maintain significant influence over the country's oil and counter-narcotics policies through continued sanctions and the threat of further military action. This represents a new model of American intervention in Latin America. Rather than installing a completely new government or occupying the country, the United States has essentially decapitated the existing regime while leaving much of its structure intact. It's a surgical approach that achieves American objectives while minimizing the costs and complications of a full-scale occupation. The Venezuelan people's response has been mixed. While many celebrated Maduro's removal, given the humanitarian crisis his government had created, others worry about what American control might mean for their country's sovereignty. The opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who had led the democratic resistance to Maduro's dictatorship, has been notably sidelined by the Trump administration, raising questions about America's commitment to genuine democracy in Venezuela. Looking at this entire history, from the 1890s to January 2026, we can see how American policy towards Venezuela has been driven by a consistent set of priorities: securing access to oil resources, preventing the emergence of governments that challenge American interests, and maintaining regional hegemony. The methods have evolved from supporting local dictators to economic sanctions to direct military intervention, but the underlying objectives have remained remarkably consistent. The capture of Nicolas Maduro represents a culmination of over a century of American involvement in Venezuelan affairs. It's the most dramatic example yet of how far the United States is willing to go to achieve its objectives in Latin America. Whether this operation ultimately serves American interests or creates new problems remains to be seen. But there's no question that it marks a new chapter in the long and complex relationship between these two nations.
What we are witnessing is not just the end of the Maduro era, but potentially the beginning of a new form of American influence in Latin America, one that combines traditional economic leverage with the willingness to use direct military force to achieve political objectives. The implications of this approach will likely reverberate throughout the region for years to